almost every night. I remember they would play taps, as they do every night, at the conclusion of the day. It's sort of the school's way of saying, go to bed, you know. But we'd play taps, and when an alumni had been killed, they would play what's called echo taps. The taps would have an echo sound. And I remember hearing that. It seemed like every night. And it was this sobering reminder of war's cost. Of course, now you can't open the newspaper or open your phone without seeing stories of what's going on in Ukraine or in the Holy Land, and it breaks our heart. And so today, my goal, when I speak to recruits, Marine Corps recruits and officers at Parris Island, when I offer briefs that are sort of like this, I'm doing it to help them make better decisions in the context of war, right? These are men and women who will send our nation's greatest treasure, our young people, potentially to die, right? This is a weighty decision. Now, thanks be to God, most of us don't have to make that decision, but we are consumers of the news. We are people who engage with civil society. We are people who shape the moral lives of our community. And so I think that this topic is just as relevant to us as it is to anyone. So, now, I am a government employee as much as I am a pastor, and so let me start with a disclaimer, right? Let me just say here at the onset that the views that I'm going to express, the things that I'm going to share today, are my own. You might have noticed, if we had the chance to talk earlier, that as Navy chaplains, we have two sides to our collar, right? We've got our rank device, lieutenant in the Navy, and we've got our faith device, right? In my case, it's a cross, signifies that I'm a chaplain. We wear these two collar devices, these two worlds. This is my role as a military officer. This is my role as a pastor. I'm going to be primarily speaking to you today from this side of the collar device. And so I just want to emphasize that what I'm saying is not necessarily the position of the Department of Defense, the Navy, the Marine Corps, any other federal entity. And so we'll just keep that in mind. I mean, given that we are talking to you about a difficult topic, I would like to open with a brief word of prayer. Will you pray with me? God of peace, we gather today to discuss a painful topic. Help us to approach it with care and with mercy. Make us sensitive to the moral complexities of our topic, and never let us forget its very real human impact. Strengthen us as your disciples, bond us together as a community, and equip us to better bring your love into a fractured world. It is in Jesus' name that we do pray. Amen. All right, so David was kind enough to give a little bit of an overview. Let me just work through our plan for today real quick. For the next hour or so, I'm going to be doing what I call laying the groundwork. I'm going to get the core information out there, survey this topic from a uniquely Christian perspective. We'll take a little break, some things to look at, conversations to be had after that, stretch your legs a little bit, and then we'll go into a Q&A on this talk. So let me just suggest, over the next hour or so, if you have a question, jot it down on your cheat sheet there, and ask it at that time. That'll be a great opportunity for some dialogue. That also will not be recorded. If you do have a question of clarification, by all means ask during the next hour or so. After that, we'll go into the videos and discussion. That'll function as an opportunity to, in some ways, humanize what we've been talking about. Then lunch. I think we'll all need it after some heavy conversations, and so I look forward to that. And then we'll go into our group activity, which I'll explain a little bit more as we get there, and then we'll wrap up the day. So, I want to start here. as we think about what war is, how war works, what some of its moral dimensions are, I want to read to you a paragraph here. And it says this, and as I read it, I'd like you to just think about where did this come from? War is amongst the greatest horrors known to humanity. It should never be romanticized. The means of war is force, applied in the form of organized violence. It is through the use of violence, or the credible threat of violence, that we compel our enemy to do our will. Violence is an essential element of war, and its immediate result is bloodshed, destruction, and suffering. While the magnitude of violence may vary with the object and means of war, the violent essence of war will never change. Any study of war that neglects this basic truth is misleading and incomplete. Where might that have come from? Any ideas what that sounds like, where a statement like that may have come from?
A GI. Somebody that was in war.
Somebody that was in war?
Just taking a stab at literature. Red Badge of Courage.
Red Badge of Courage from literature. Any other thoughts where this may have come from? This comes from the United States Marine Corps' warfighting doctrine, right? Marine Corps warfighting doctrine, publication number 1, which is titled Warfighting, which I would suggest is freely available. I would encourage you to read it. You can find it online. But sometimes I read this, and it's not really what you would expect from people who are charged to discharge war in the world, to begin with this statement that war is a horror, that war brings untold suffering, that we should never romanticize war. Sometimes people find that a little surprising that that would come from the pen of the United States Marine Corps. But I'm glad that they do. And the reason I like to start here is for 2 reasons. First, I think it offers us a good definition of what we're talking about today. We're talking about organized violence. Violence on such a scale that it can generate political change, right? That it can, in their words, compel our enemy to do our will, right? I like to start there because it reminds us of what war is in its very nature. We hear the word war a lot, right? War on crime, war on poverty, war, right? When we talk about war, at least in the context of this presentation, we're talking about this. We're talking about organized violence, right? On a large scale, right? But what I also like about this quote here is that it doesn't let us ignore. In fact, the very last line, it refuses to let us acknowledge that war brings with it human impacts, right? Bloodshed, destruction, suffering, right? And so I love this in particular because as Christians called to serve and love the most vulnerable amongst us, we cannot, should not, must not ignore those topics. And so over the course of the time that we have together today, let me encourage you here from the onset to think about these 2 factors. 1, the nature of war itself, and 2, the impacts of war on people and on the world and on God's good creation. So what's our question for today? All right? What are we trying to explore? Given the brutality of war, I think that we just articulated in the previous slide and the previous definition, I want to suggest that as Christians, when we speak of war, we are never speaking of something that is good. All right? War war is not a good thing. I love this quote that I've stuck up here from a theologian named Oliver O'Donovan, an English Anglican theologian. He says, God's peace is the original ontological truth of creation. He goes on to say God's peace is the goal of history. Right? When we open our Bibles, what do we see? We see in Genesis, we see the goodness of God's creation. That's the state in which God has created the world. And then we look forward to a redeemed world where all may live in peace. We find ourselves today somewhere between those extremes, between those two bookends of reality. And so I love what Oliver O'Donovan points out here, and I think it's good for us to hear as well, that when we speak about war, we are speaking about something that was neither God's original design for the world, nor God's future ambition for the world. Right? And so our question, our guiding belief is that war is not a good thing. So our question becomes something more properly like this. In a Christian moral framework, right, as Christians, can war ever be justified? Right? In other words, can Christians support something which is, at least momentarily, contrary to peace? And if they can, on what grounds? And if they can't, what are the consequences thereof? So, as Christians answering that question, whether war can be justified, I think exposes at least three, what I kind of call tension points. Right? So these are points where that question, war's potential justification, runs up against some of our central claims of faith. The first one that I'm going to talk about, and I'm probably going to park myself on it for a little bit and really work through it, is what I would call the biblical tension. Right? There is a tension in Scripture on this issue that we need to be alert to, and I think we all are alert to it in some way, shape, or form when we seek to analyze this issue and many others using Scripture. The next is the tension that we see between peace and what we might call justice in the world. And of course, third is the tension that exists within war's impact on humans, on people, particularly the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized. And so I want to start with the biblical tension. I'm going to grab my Bible to do it. And let me just say here, this tension point, I think, is rooted in the idea that Scripture is not, what we'll call univocal on the issue of warfare. What that means is it doesn't speak with one voice. Right? Sometimes we want to think that the Bible offers us a consistent, a cohesive argument for or against something. But in reality, your Bible, our Bible, is an anthology. It is in itself a small library of texts written from across time, across cultures, across languages, across political realities, and it's packaged together. It doesn't always speak with the same voice or message on this issue. And so as Christians who are seeking some sort of clarity on the issue of warfare, sometimes we find ourselves a little confused. Right? So, this confusion, I think, stems from the fact that in some texts in Scripture, across both testaments, I might add, war and violence are seemingly praised or even commanded by God, or at the very least presented as acts of faith. In other texts, war and violence and causing harm to others or the world around us appears to be condemned outright, or at the very least presented as incompatible with a Christian expression of faith. I'm going to give you some examples. And if I don't know if you have script Bibles with you, but if you do, feel free to follow along with me. The first one I want to go to is in the book of Joshua, the first chapter, verses 1 through 6. And I'll read it to you. This is my test to know if I know the order of the books of the Bible. All right. Joshua 1, verses 1 through 6. Listen with me here. He says, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, 'My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses, from the wilderness and the Lebanon as far as the great river to the Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I have swore to their ancestors to give them.'" Now that doesn't seem awful on the onset until you remember that what they are talking about here is laying the ground for the invasion of a land that is occupied by existing peoples, right? God is instructing them, lead your armies into this land. And let's see where this goes, right? Flick with me, if you have your scriptures, to Deuteronomy 13. Deuteronomy 13, 12 to 18. "If you hear it said about one of the towns that the Lord your God is giving to you to live in, that scoundrels from among you have gone out and led the inhabitants of the town astray, saying, 'Let us go and worship other gods, whom you have not known,' then you shall inquire and make a thorough investigation. If a charge is established that such an abhorrent thing has been done among you, you shall put the inhabitants of that town to the sword, utterly destroying it and everything in it, even putting its livestock to the sword. All of its spoil you shall gather into its public square, and then burn the town, and all of its spoil with fire, as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. It shall remain a perpetual ruin, never to be rebuilt." Or we can go to 1 Samuel, chapter 15, verses 1 to 3. First Samuel 15, 1 to 3. This is asking in some ways, did that actually come to pass? "Samuel said to Saul, 'The Lord sent me to anoint you king over the people Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they have done in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek. Utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey.'" We could go on. The image that you see there is the siege of Jericho, a famous story, a story that is actually, I even heard with my daughter in Sunday school that there's songs about this, right? But what's happening? We have siege being laid to a city, which is then annihilated. Man, woman, child, livestock, homes destroyed, killed, burned. But lest we think that this is just an Old Testament problem, right? Which we sometimes do. We say, oh, the God of the Old Testament is this angry, judgmental, and sort of violent God, but in contrast, the God of the New Testament is something contrary, something peaceful, something good, something harmonious. We might like to remember that the book of Revelation is probably the most violent text in the Bible. Right? We can look at texts like Revelation 14 to 16. I know where this one is. It's in the end. Revelation 14. This comes to us from our New Testament. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. These judgment texts, I mean, they're speaking about harm and violence in a very real way. And even Jesus himself, right, incorporates violence from time to time into his own teaching, right? There's a parable, for example, in Luke 12, verses 45 to 47, if you're interested, where Jesus speaks on killing slaves. These are hard texts to read, and this is just a short sample. You can see my notes. I don't want to go through all of them, right? But we also hold those very same texts in a sort of tension, right, with other texts which seemingly present the opposite. These are the texts that are, probably a little bit easier to preach on a Sunday morning, but these are the ones like Matthew 5, right? So this is the Sermon on the Mount. Turn the other cheek, right? When someone harms you. If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. Matthew 26. Live in peace with everyone. Hebrews 12. Jesus praising peacemaking. Jesus himself confronted with injustice and a sham trial and facing the brutality of his own execution, goes silently to the cross. What's my point, right? My point here is that the Bible offers us, shall we call it, a diversity of perspectives on war. And people, depending on their personal leanings, have a tendency to say, well, aha, you see? It says this. Aha. It says this. In truth, it doesn't offer us a consistent or constant ethic on the use of violence. Now, I would say that that is challenging. It is challenging. But it also is an opportunity. It's an opportunity because no matter where we stand, no matter what is going on in our world, no matter what challenges we face, we have a Bible which challenges us, which pushes us, which invites us to grow, invites us to think a little bit deeper about what's going on. And so I offer that as a tension point. I wish I had some, nugget of truth that I could say, well, this is how this is all fits together. I don't. But what I do have is this idea that in faith, we often sit in the tension of complex ethical issues. This is not as easy an issue as we might like it to be. Which brings us to our next point of tension. Peace and justice. Right? Acts of intentional violence, well, they feel incompatible in some ways with following Jesus, right? You can read these texts that I just read earlier and you can say, okay, well, a lot of those have to deal with particular societies or eschatological, so end times issues, but what does Jesus himself have to say? Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Jesus is the embodiment of God in the world. And so if we focus in on the gospel witness, there's something I must confess. There is something that feels a little incompatible, right? With what we said on the first slide, organized violence on a sufficient scale to impact political change. That doesn't seem to mesh very well with the witness of the one who went to the cross. Yet, failing to respond to acts of violence, failing to respond to acts of tyranny, threats, or injustice, well, that also feels incompatible, right? Jesus may be the Prince of Peace, but he is not a passive witness to the world. And so we have this inner conflict, this inner dialogue, I think, between what does it mean to follow the one who is the embodiment, the enfleshment, Emmanuel, right, of love, and also having the ways and the means to respond to gross injustice in the world and failing to use it. It's a hard topic. The third, I think, relates to its human impact. And this is part of why I selected that reading from the Marine Corps earlier. War is undeniably brutal. I think that has come into sharp focus for many of us over the past few months, past 2 years especially, as we've watched war unfold on our TVs, right? It has a disproportionate impact on marginalized, poor, vulnerable people. It has an outsized impact on God's created world, on the environment, right? The people that God calls on us, the people in this room, like the reason that we probably are here is to serve the vulnerable. So we see what war can do to those very same people. And yet, we also recognize that there is often a cost to inaction. Right? So failing to do something, failing to respond, also has a cost, and sometimes it's a cost that we can't quite calculate or put our thumb on, right? Because it doesn't always materialize when we do act. But this, I think, is one of those moral challenges. Right? I have to think that if we see the world through Christ's eyes, our heart might be shattered by human suffering, right? Especially on a magnitude that war often brings. But I also think Christ's heart may be shattered by passivity. Right? And so how do we navigate that? So let me propose to you a couple of Christian answers to this. And my point is not really to convert you to any of them, right? But rather to help you to understand the breadth of ways that Christians across the world, really since the beginning of the church, have grappled with this question. And remember, our question at the beginning is not is war is good, but how do we navigate these particular tension points faithfully? And if you have your cheat sheet, this is on there too, if you want to follow along. But I like to think that there has been 5 primary Christian views of war. And as I talk through them a little bit, some of you might say, aha, that's me, or that's not me. What I'm going to do here is give you a little survey on them real quick, and then I'll dive a little bit deeper into them. The 5 primary views, these are not the only views, right? So you might be able to think about different ways of engaging this topic, but these are sort of the ones that throughout history have been most prevalent. The first is pacifism. right? And pacifism says, you can't, right? Given those tension points, given the realities of war, given who Christ is, war cannot be justified as it is by its very nature contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's another view, which is what they call preventative war. And preventative war says something like, war can be justified, but only if it is used to prevent expected future harms. All right? So if we feel quite certain that something really terrible is coming down the pipe, maybe we have the moral authority, maybe even the moral mandate to prevent that from happening. Then there's something called humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian interventions received a lot of attention over the past couple decades, but what this basically says is that war can be justified if it is used to liberate people from immense suffering. Right? So, if we know that people are experiencing something really horrific, and war can do something to stop that, well, maybe we have a moral license to do so. Prominent one from history, holy war or religious war. Right? This might say that, well, war can be justified when used to expand God's kingdom or alleviate threats to Christians. We'll talk about that one in a second, but that's sort of your crusader mentality. And then the just war tradition, right? I will just give you my little asterisks here. We're going to dive into the just war tradition in greater depth than the other ones, because this is the one that is probably the dominant ethical view across the global church. It's even one of those issues that has kind of become secularized and infused itself into international law regarding armed conflict. So I really want to make sure we get that one. But let's take a look at these real quick. So pacifism. The first thing I want to say about pacifism is that pacifism does not imply passivity. Right? It's not what it means. Sometimes people have this view that people who embrace pacifism are just kind of blindly ignoring issues or choosing not to engage in those issues, but that's not quite right. What pacifism is the choice not to embrace violent solutions to problems. Right? So there is engagement with the issues of the world. It's just the tools that are used are non-violent tools. Now, where does this come from? Well, pacifists generally understand that Jesus, himself a relatively non-violent man, I suppose we can look at certain instances, flipping the tables and stuff like that, but generally speaking, a non-violent man, that he embodies what is right and good, right? When Jesus says, "Follow me," he's not joking, right? Literally means pattern your life after the way that I live, right? And so following Jesus then necessitates living as Jesus lived, facing threats, facing geopolitical challenges as he faced them. Now, one of the critiques often of pacifism is that pacifism doesn't work all the time, right? Like, it's not going to solve, if you were a pacifist Ukrainian, that's not going to stop the Russians from crossing the border. Right? But what a pacifist would generally say is, my goal is not utilitarianism. My goal is obedience to the risen Lord. Right? My goal is obedience to the gospel. That's my highest good. Right? So my doctoral advisor is a pacifist, a pacifist thinker. And this is one thing that he'll often talk about, that when we think about pacifism, we're not talking about what is the most effective solution to a problem. We're talking about what is the most faithful solution to a problem, right? Jesus, no doubt, could have done things to prevent his crucifixion and chose not to. Right, so this is sort of where this where this comes from. Now, I will say that pacifism was really, for at least the first couple hundred years of the church, 300-400 years of the church, was really the dominant ethical model within the Christian tradition, right? From what we can read and see. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. Like, one of those reasons is theological, ideological. The other part of that is that most Christians in the world during the first couple hundreds of years of the church were under Roman rule, right? And couldn't or wouldn't fight under the Roman emperor, who was himself considered at least pseudo-divine, right? There were all sorts of religious rituals and military liturgy, right? They sought to avoid. But at least a good part of it was ideological. There's lots of early church father writings that absolutely speak to a pushback against war. Our second bit was preventative war. The picture here is the Iraq nuclear complex in Iran, right? Which was a location where it was believed, and may well bet, don't know, but it was believed that this was a place where the ground was being laid for the development of nuclear weapons. All right? So it's just an example. Right? This might be something that would fall into the idea of preventative war. Preventative war basically believes that force can and maybe should be used when there is a credible risk of future harm. Right? Let's bring that down to the most basic sort of level, right? Like if I know that there is a kid on the playground who tomorrow is going to harm my daughter on the playground, I probably should intervene now, right? As opposed to waiting for that to happen. This is the same logic, though on a far bigger scale, that this proposes. So some preventative war thinkers believe that a risk must be imminent, right? Now, what does that mean? Well, that could mean something like an army that's mobilizing on your national borders or something, or intelligence that very clearly suggests that really dangerous weapons are about to be deployed. Hint, hint, some of this stuff might come up in our videos later. But this kind of thing, right? So it's basically saying if something's imminent, then you have a duty to respond, or at least you can respond in a way that is kind of parallel to a conventional attack having occurred. Now others, though, are less stringent, right? And they believe that force can be applied in response to a developing threat. So this is like this nuclear program. It's basically saying they might be developing a weapon. They might use that weapon. They might have that potential. We don't want them to even have the potential, right? So I don't even want to get them to a point where that weapon is able to be in the air. Now the key, what I think is the key ethical question here is, can a nation ever be justified in attacking another nation before they do something violent? It's kind of a hard thing. You wouldn't arrest someone before they've committed a crime, right? And so how do we think about this particular issue? It's not easy. Humanitarian intervention. This is one that, for a lot of people, they're like, yep, I can buy this one, right? This feels good, but it's actually a little more complicated than we think, right? So humanitarian intervention believes that force can be justified in response to a humanitarian crisis, right? Even if the attacking party is not faced with their own threat, right? So examples of this might include things like genocide or mass displacement, mass starvation, grossly unjust or oppressive political regimes, this kind of thing happening in the world. Right? So, for example, people have thought, well, if we could go back in time and use military force to intervene in, let's say, the Rwandan genocide, would we be justified in doing that? It's a great debate to have. Right? But the key ethical question here is basically, can a nation attack another nation or non-state group when it is not personally threatened? right? Can we be the Good Samaritan? A lot of people have used this argument to say, well, the United States or other nations, they're trying to be the world's policeman, right? They're meddling into conflicts that are not theirs. So it's a valid question to ask. It's a thing to untangle. And it often relates to this. Holy war, sanctum bellum, right? Holy war, religious war. Maybe I should just start with the last bullet point here and just say that there's no credible Christian ethicist that I have ever known or read that thinks that this is a valid choice anymore, right? And in fact, I think most people would say that using your religious beliefs to justify violence and using your religious beliefs alone, we have another word for that, and it's terrorism, right? And so this is not something that I want to suggest is an active and living ethical model, but I bring it up because it is a model that for hundreds of years Christians have embraced, and even maybe today, right? There's still this sense of using faith to justify conflict, right? So what people who adhere to this mentality do is they're not totally off base. They're going to read some of the same texts that I read to you a handful of minutes ago, and they're going to say, well, you see, God approves of invasion for the purpose of establishing, let's say, a religious home, right? God approves of going into a territory and using lethal force for the purpose of obedience to God's word. Now, we have seen this happen, right? So the Crusades is probably the most prolific example, right? We have the Reconquista, right? It's a similar kind of thing. We even have the Yugoslav Wars, which I guess was in the early 90s, right? So this was a conflict that was waged by Christian groups against Muslim groups. Which brings us to the just war tradition. Okay? So the just war tradition effectively says that, okay, war can be justified, but, big, bold, underline that word, but only under very limited circumstances, and if you do it, you must fight it in particular ways. Right? So it's basically giving a qualified yes to the answer of, can war ever be justified within a Christian moral framework? It says, yes, asterisk, but under very limited circumstances. And so you can probably already see how what they're attempting to do is balance some of those texts that I just read. They're trying to say, well, yep, there might be occasions where it is permissible for a God-following Christian to support war, but we must temper that with the gospel witness. We have to hold both of those things in tension with each other. And so there's really two parts. And I'll give you just, it's called jus ad bellum and jus in bello, which is just fancy Latin. I don't like to do that, but that's just what it's always called, right? The first is the right reasons to go to war. Some people call it right decision making, right? And the other one is right conduct in war, just conduct in war. For a war to be just under the just war tradition, you have to have both, right? You can't have the right motivations for going into war and really lousy tactics. And you can't have, the world's best and most ethical tactics, but a lousy reason for going into war. It doesn't work. You have to marry those two things up. Now, like I said, this is something that I want to focus a little bit of my attention on because it's churches can't agree on anything, right? Churches agree on nothing. That's why when you drive down the street, you see a Presbyterian church and a Methodist church and a Catholic church and Orthodox church and Baptist church, whatever, right? We love to disagree. This is one of those things that, for the most part, we kind of agree on, right? Officially, at least. Of course, there's diversity of thought, but this is something that you see in the Catholic tradition, you see it in the Protestant tradition, including our own Reformed tradition, you see it in the Orthodox tradition, you see it all over the place, right? So it's one of those approaches to this question of whether war can be justified that is widely embraced across Christendom. Not universally embraced, of course, we've just talked about some other models, but it has pretty wide embrace and pretty wide appeal. And as I said earlier, it's also something that has significantly shaped the international law on this topic, right? So as a military person, right, I have to follow what we call LOAC, the Laws of Armed Conflict. Right? In my wallet, I have an ID card. What does it say on there? It says Geneva Convention's identification card, right? Which means we are adhering to the Geneva Convention, so international laws on conflict, which if you ever dig into them, is just saturated in what I'm about to tell you. As is the UN Charter, as is so many other bodies of international politics and international law. And so what does it tell us? Well, let's start with the first, right? So this is the right reasons for going to war. And this is not a menu, right? We don't look at it and say, I want some of that, some of this. You have to tick all these boxes, right? Consider it like a recipe, as opposed to a menu. The first is just cause. Now, a just cause means you have to have a valid reason for going to war. And what that basically means, if you read a lot of these are all a little bit, people have their own spins on this, but if you get really orthodox with it, what it's saying is it has to be a response to a grave injustice that you've experienced, right? So like an invasion, an attack, right? These kinds of things. That's your cause. That's the spark for conflict. You don't go to war. In contrast, you don't go to war for an unjust cause. And most Christians would say, let's say you wanted to invade a country for the purpose of gaining its resources. You wanted to invade a country for to capture its people, right? Or to expand your wealth, or just to expand your own sense of kingdom or something. Those aren't just causes. A just cause means something unjust has occurred to you that you are responding to and seeking to correct. The other is a legitimate authority. So, Providence Presbyterian Church can't declare war, right? I hope, right? Don't do it, right? It has to be organized by an established representative government or ruler. So only governmental bodies have the right to declare war. It can't just be, a loose band of people who have an ideological interest in something who declare war. It's a national enterprise, right, in response to a just cause. Right intention. Okay, now some people look at this and they say, these sound the same. Just cause, right intention. They're a little bit different. A just cause is the spark that motivates the military action. The intention is, what do you want to get out of it? What's your goal? So for Christians, what we would say is the ultimate goal must be peace. Right? If we are going to engage in warfighting, we do so to, as quickly as possible, restore a state of peace and justice. Right? So we want to go back to the condition that existed before the just cause spark. Last resort. Last resort says, before we start putting bullets downrange, we have to exhaust all peaceful options, all reasonable peaceful options. We have to make a good faith effort to avoid bloodshed, right? Warfare is not our first course, right? Shouldn't be, can't be under the just war tradition. It is something that we are basically forced into, right? That we've exhausted other options. And I should say there too, even when war begins, we should be continually seeking peaceful resolutions to that conflict. Proportionality. You're going to see this on the next bit too, but as it relates to the question of going to war, what we basically say is, yeah, you can have a just cause, so something bad can happen to you. You can have a legitimate authority, you can have a government, you can have the desire to restore peace, you can have a last resort, but at the same time, like, war is not always the right solution to the problem, right? It has to be proportionate. A small harm doesn't necessitate or validate a massive military response, right? So your response has to be proportionate to the injustice that has motivated the conflict. Does that kind of make sense? A little bit? Okay. And then the chance of success. Chance of success is a little bit of a challenging one, but basically what it means is this. We don't engage in suicide missions, right? So if there is no hope of success, then we don't engage in war fighting, because all it will do is cause undue suffering, right, is the way that this is generally understood. So these are the reasons, these are what we call like the right decision criteria, the jus ad bellum criteria. So this is what it looks like to go to war. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we have a situation that has satisfied all of those criteria there. Now, how do we fight that war? This is the other piece of the puzzle. The first is we have to respect what is called non-combatant immunity. Non-combatant immunity means that care must be taken to avoid or limit civilian casualties, right? So in other words, the only legitimate targets are military targets, right? That's really difficult, right? Especially when you're engaging with combatants who don't always wear uniform or who embed themselves in civilian areas, as we will also see in some of our videos later. So the care must be taken to limit civilian harm. You never intentionally engage a non-combatant. And care should also be taken in this same principle to protect civilian resources, right? So we've seen examples over the past few months of belligerents using places like schools and hospitals, right, as military, as combatant posts, right? That's a no-go under the just war tradition, right? Because it blurs the line between what is protected and what is a legitimate military target. There's also a sense of proportionality here, right? So whereas in the first set of criteria, the proportionality was, is war the blunt instrument that we need to use? Here it's saying the level of force that I apply in a given situation also has to kind of reconcile to what I'm going to get back. So if Sam here, punches me in the face, which will probably hurt, right? If Sam punches me in the face here, I'm probably not authorized to destroy his home and kill him. That's not a proportionate response, right? And so there has to be this level of proportionality in our combat tactics. And then importantly, protection of legal rights, right? So we are signatories of the laws of armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions, these kinds of things. And those prohibit certain weapons and certain tactics, right? So just an example, stuff like sexual violence, right? Prohibited weapons, certain types of gas and chemical weapons, for example, right? They cause undue suffering. They are never legitimate tools of war under any circumstances. Now, there's some critiques to this model. That's sort of the summary, high-level summary of this model. I should also say I didn't focus in on the interest of time. I didn't focus in on these particular areas, but there is also a school of thought within the just war tradition that is called just post-bellum, right? So what does ethics demand of us post-war, after war? But I wanted to focus in on these two as they're the most dominant. Now there's a couple of critiques that maybe some of you have already thought of as it relates to the just war tradition. And these are things that I think they're perfectly valid, very valid critiques, right? So something can be the dominant model of Christian ethics and also be flawed, all right? We're doing this imperfectly. The first one, and these are in no particular order, but the first one is that it embraces, or should I say, it negates revolutionary violence, right? And so in that sense, you'll have some scholars that will say it takes kind of a colonial worldview, right? And what that means is, you think back to the legitimate authority thing. What it basically says is the only people that are authorized to use military force is a recognized government or a recognized ruler. Well, that begs a certain question, right? What if you are not that and you need to throw off that legitimate ruler, right? Think about the American Revolution, for example. Was the American Revolution a just war? Those colonists had no legal right. In fact, it was treason to take up arms against King George, right? And so that's a valid critique. People might say that if you want to be very strict about the just war tradition, that probably shouldn't have happened, right? And so there's that issue there. There's also the difficulty in embracing what we call hybrid warfare, right? And so hybrid warfare in this sense is warfare that makes use of lots of different skill sets, some of them combatants, some of them not, right? And how do we deal with that? The just war tradition, cards on the table, really came out of a time in history when people were meeting on fields of battle. Pitched battle it's called. We knew who the enemy was. We knew who the combatants were and who they were not. It's got a little bit of a difficulty with adapting to war in the modern world. Some scholars have said it has an incoherent view of victory, right? It doesn't lay out what the actual criteria of victory is. It's just sort of this return to peace kind of thing, which seems like a pretty good victory to me. But, there are people that will argue against that and say, well, if war is a political instrument, then it needs to be able to articulate the political goals. And there is validity to this. You remember over the past 20 years of war in like Afghanistan and Iraq, what was one of the common critiques that you would hear on television? It was, what's the goal here? What are we trying to achieve? What's our end state? What does victory look like? And sometimes the just war tradition is, struggles to share that. It also has a difficulty in delineating between combatants and non-combatants, right? So I talked a little bit before about those who don't wear uniforms, things like that. We also have questions about, let's say the use of contractors and supply lines, right? Are those combatants or are those non-combatants, right? So if you are a civilian hacker collective that is engaging in cyber warfare to increase the lethality of conventional attacks, are you a combatant or are you not? Don't know. It's a good question, right? And as we said earlier, a lack of clarity on what I'm going to call multi-use targets, right? So think about like an electrical grid, right? An electrical grid might be essential for warfighting, but it's also essential for keeping the lights on in hospitals, things like that. All right, getting towards the end here. How to use it. I'm going to go back to Oliver O'Donovan, all right? And this is going to help you when you get to your case studies here. So Oliver O'Donovan basically says we need to avoid maybe the mentality of just like checking off. Is it a yes or is it a no? All right? And what he would almost argue is it's a spectrum. You almost want to say you have wholly unjust on this side and wholly just on this side. So they're both probably imagined extremes, right? One's really bad, one's perfectly good. We exist somewhere in the middle, right? And so we want our actions to be a little bit closer to the wholly just side, even knowing that they'll get totally there, right? And so bear that in mind. You know, where we don't quite hit the mark, that's space for valid criticism. Right? As Christians, as citizens, we should critique the military. Right? We should critique force. But we critique in that space. The space between the moral ideal and actualized force. And then the other spot, you know, the space between actualized force and kind of the extremely unjust, right? Hopefully we're not in that space. And so what I like to say is that just war gives us a moral language to use in relation to war. I suspect that as you looked at that cheat sheet and you heard some of the things that I said there, right, you might have thought, oh, well, that's a word that describes something that I'm feeling or I'm seeing, right, or have seen in the world, right? So it gives us kind of a moral language to talk, and then better allows us to engage with the complexities of war. Now, I would probably get fired if I didn't do the next slide, and so I just want to pause, shift gears a little bit, and just tell you a little bit about what we do as military chaplains, because in your kind introduction, you explained that, you know, kind of like working in a mission environment, so like in a mission field. And so I don't know how many people know that the Presbyterian Church USA has that mission field. And so let me just tell you a little bit about it. We have 98 PC USA ministers, right? So these are ordained Presbyterian pastors who are serving as chaplains in the armed forces of the United States. Right? It's broken out across the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, Space Force, I don't know, part of the Air Force, right? As Navy chaplains, we serve the sea services. So we serve the Marines, we serve the Coast Guard, we serve the Navy. There's even one or two kind of coveted billets at the Merchant Marine Academy in New York, which is kind of a nice spot. So for me, right now, I'm a naval officer. I'm serving with the Marines. My day-to-day uniform is not this. It's Marine camouflage. Right? And in a few months, I will put on a Navy fire-retardant sailing suit and be on a destroyer in the middle of the ocean somewhere. All right? So all of these chaplains must be ordained and experienced ministers. They have to have a certain amount of work in the parish setting. That's where my background with the Presbytery of Charlotte is. I worked for a handful of years at Covenant Presbyterian. We are all non-combatants. Right? I do not carry a weapon, even in combat, and we do go to combat. Right? I do not carry a weapon. I do not receive weapons training. Right? We do deploy with our units. Chaplains are from time to time killed in battle. Right? Like we do go to our people. We go where they go. When my ship deploys, I will deploy. If they're gone for 12 months, I'm gone for 12 months. Right? You spend your entire time with them. If your Marine Corps unit deploys, you go. You're a part of the team. We're endorsed for service by what's called Presbyterian Federal Chaplaincies, which is a ministry of the PCUSA, but they also serve the Korean Presbyterian Church and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And I can't speak for the Army or the Air Force, but in the Navy, we like to say that we have 4 core competencies. We provide, facilitate, care, and advise. So provide means we provide for the religious needs of our people in accordance with our religious organization, right? So when I lead services, if you ever came to Paris Island or you went on my ship or something and you sat down in a pew, you would recognize it. It would look almost indistinguishable from what you would see on a Sunday morning here, right? And the same thing, if I was a Southern Baptist chaplain or a Catholic chaplain or a Buddhist chaplain, the services would reflect that. But we also facilitate for the needs of others. So I'm not a priest. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not an imam. But for those who need those resources, I help to ensure that their First Amendment rights and their free exercise of religion is enabled. Provide care to everyone. So to our sailors, to our Marines, to our Coast Guardsmen, and to their families and dependents. Provide provide counseling and support and resources and training. And we also advise our chain of command. So I am my commander's advisor on questions of ethics, on questions of religion, on questions of morale and command climate, these kinds of things, right? I'll be the one that he'll go to for those questions. Okay, I've talked for long enough. I think you probably have a good survey of the land. So why don't we, if you're okay with it, why don't we take a little break and stretch your legs, and then we'll come back for Q&A. And again, we'll turn the video off, and you can ask whatever questions are on your mind.
Cut it off.
Yep.
Okay. So let's take about 10 minutes. Men's room, there are no women inside the building today, so it's acceptable to use the